Hi, I'm Deanna Springer.
And I'm Dana Casey with a fun Stitch It Sisters sewing project and classic time-saving tips by Nancy Zieman.
First, let's take a look at the project we're making today. We'll be making circle quilt blocks. We'll also be making half-circle quilt blocks and quarter-circle quilt blocks, all with Clover's Trace and Create Carefree Curves quilt collection and Nancy's Carefree Curves and Quilts easy methods of sewing curves and quilts without ever cutting a curve.
Making Carefree Curves and Quilts is a great project for first-time quilters.
To make our circle block, we'll be using our Riley Blake fabrics, some Pellon Sof-Shape Interfacing. Yes, we're using interfacing in quilts. We're using Clover's point-to-point turner, a rotary cutter with a pinking blade, Schmetz quilting needles, and our first step will be to cut some easy squares, but always a classic time-saving tip from Nancy Zieman is to press and starch your fabric. So head to the ironing board with your selected fabrics and use June Taylor's Starch Savvy and give your fabric 2 treatments of spray and starch.
Well worth the time and effort because it makes for a nice crisp quilt.
Right, the more stiff the fabric is, the easier the process goes. First, we'll start by cutting our background fabric squares. We're cutting our background fabric squares 8.5 inches because we're making 8-inch quilt blocks. We'll be using the circle template from the Carefree Curves quilt collection. And in the template package, you'll find complete directions for sewing 3 different blocks, all circle blocks. We'll be focusing on the 8-inch quilt block today.
Okay.
So we're cutting 8.5-inch background squares, and we'll be cutting 7-inch squares of fusible interfacing and a 7-inch square of our circle fabric. We're actually making a circle applique. But it's basically, we're stitching a circle. So you'll take your fabric for your circle and you'll layer the interfacing right sides together with the right side of the fabric. So smooth side of interfacing to smooth side of fabric. Just remember right sides together. The glue dots of the fusible interfacing are facing upward. And then we'll place our template, our circle template, over our fabric stack. The fusible interfacing is on top. And we'll take a marking pen and we're going to mark our circle. I'm tracing the die cut areas on the template, and I'm also marking the position at each quarter, and that'll come in handy later. And you can see that will be our stitching line. If you want a complete stitching line, you can give the template a quarter turn and continue tracing those die cut areas.
Meet the lines together.
You could meet the lines, or you could just throw caution to the wind and stitch without having a complete circle. The machine actually, as you're stitching, naturally forms that curve as you continue. So here is our stitch sample. We've taken it to the sewing machine and we've stitched right on that line, stitching all the way around, making a complete circle. The next step is to cut away some of that interfacing. We'll be cutting away the center and we'll be leaving 1 inch of interfacing all the way around. And you'll take care to not cut that background fabric. And you'll cut, leaving about 1 inch of interfacing in that inner circle. The next step is to go to the rotary mat and use your pinking shears or use a pinking blade in a 45mm rotary cutter and trim around the outside edge. The next step would be to turn it. We're using Clover's point-to-point turner to turn this right side out. Excuse me. So we're turning. And we're actually going to use the curve side of the point-to-point turner and turn that fabric circle right side out.
And that'll follow the natural curve as well.
Right. And it opens that seam allowance. That point-to-point turner is in there doing the work for you. so that when you later take this to the ironing board and press that fusible interfacing down, you'll have nice circles. That glue dot of the interfacing is actually facing the back of the fabric now.
Okay.
So when we press this, we have a nice circle.
Nice.
Here's the back, it's all fused into place. And this is where we'll reference, the next step, we'll reference these quarter markings.
Okay.
We're going to take our background square and we're going to fold it. So I'll use this background square here and we're going to fold it. Right sides together. And we're going to quarter mark it. And this is where I like to use, instead of an iron, these are just temporary markings.
Okay.
So I don't want to use the heat of an iron, you'll permanently set those creases. But I use the roll and press to find my quarter markings. And then you open that back up. That's your background fabric. The next step would be to find your quarter marks on your circle applique. And then I position that circle applique using these 1/4 inch marks to the center of the block. And then you do a little pinning. And the traditional way of pinning would be to put a pin overextending the edges.
Okay.
I like to pin the circle blocks to the background block with the pins not extending.
Oh, with the pin heads on the inside.
Right,
Or
we're
the
placing
center.
pins in the center because when we come to the sewing machine, the next step will be to stitch this down. So when we come around and stitch, the pins are out of our way.
Okay.
And you can see on our next sample some stitching options. You could stitch with a zigzag, you could straight stitch,
Okay.
you could choose a blind hem stitch, or you could choose our favorite, the hem stitch. The hem stitch was typically used for hemming pants or hemming skirts, things like that, but we've used it in this quilt block just to hand pick or hand stitch, assimilate hand stitching
Fun.
the applique to the background fabric. And we use monofilament thread. So as you're stitching, these stitches will disappear. I've used black thread so that you can see this.
Okay.
But use monofilament thread and then the stitches disappear and the quilt block floats. So you have a floating circle applique on your circle quilt block. Next up, half square circle blocks.
Yay.
To make our half circle block, we'll start by making circle blocks. We'll use, again, the Carefree Curves quilt template, and we'll reference the template to make 14-inch blocks. We're going to cut 14.5-inch background squares. And for the circle, we'll be cutting 11.5-inch circle fabric squares and 11.5-inch Fusible Sof-Shape Interfacing squares.
Okay.
We'll use the same steps for making circle blocks as we did with our smaller blocks.
Okay.
The next step would be to cut these in half. So with a rotary cutter and a ruler, cut your blocks in half.
Okay.
You could mix it up and make 2 different opposing quilt blocks.
Okay. So like mirror images, kind of.
Right. This circle fabric is now the background fabric, and this circle fabric is the background fabric.
Okay.
So you can make an entire quilt from one block, a 1-block quilt, or you could mix it up. For each half circle block, we need to cut the blocks in half and insert a 1-inch strip of fabric. So I've just cut 1-inch strip of fabric for each block, and we'll cut the blocks in half and insert that strip.
Completely changes the look of your quilt.
It does. And you just put right sides together and stitch with a scant 1/4 inch. We always use a scant 1/4 inch in quilting. And then you'll open that seam and press it and stitch it to the other block, the other half circle block. And in this virtual quilt, you'll see how just changing the fabrics around can make completely different looking quilts. Next up are quarter-circle blocks. To make our quarter-circle quilt blocks, we'll start by making circle blocks. So with the circle template from the Carefree Curves collection, we'll make circles and squares. So we'll need to cut some fabrics.
Okay.
The difference with this block, because we're making quarter circle blocks, we need to cut the background fabric a little larger because we're cutting it apart into quarters and then sewing it back together. So we need a little more background fabric. So we're cutting quarter circle background fabric squares a 1/2 inch larger.
Okay.
So these are cut at 9 inches, cut 9-inch background squares, and the circles are the same. Those are 7-inch squares to make our circles.
Okay.
So you'll complete your circle block, and when you're finished, we'll cut it into quarters. So we can make opposing colored blocks and then cut them into quarters. And by simply turning the quilt blocks, you can achieve different designs. The quarter circle block is commonly known as the drunkard's path block,
Okay.
but you can stitch a lot of different quilt designs from quarter circle blocks. And you'll see in our virtual quilts, the drunkard's path classic design, the fool's puzzle, and by turning the blocks again, you can achieve the Mohawk trail. Here's the mill wheel and blackbird's pie. Both the mill wheel and blackbird's pie are made from using opposing blocks.
Okay.
You can also do a variation on a quarter circle block. The same technique, only different. So we'll start with a 9-inch background square,
Okay.
but we'll add some quarter circles that are already cut apart. So instead of stitching our circles to the background fabric, we're going to cut our circles,
Okay.
and we'll place them in opposing corners. Using the same techniques, we'll stitch the quarter circles to the background fabric. And that'll give us a unique design. And we call this the propeller. The propeller block can be made into a quilt, or you can mix it up and make a mill wheel variation with the quarter circles sewn in different sizes in opposing quarters. We hope you'll try Nancy's Carefree Curves method in your next quilt. We hope you've enjoyed this Stitch It Sisters project. You'll find this template along with a limited number of bundle boxes at stitchitsisters.com.
Be sure to tune in again for another fun Stitch It Sisters sewing project.
In the meantime, connect with Stitch It Sisters and friends on our social sites. Stitch It Sisters is made possible by Clover, Pellon, Schmetz Needles, and shopnzp.com.